Also ich begrüße Sie zu unserer Nachmittagssession von unserem Public Program und ich werde jetzt in Englisch fortsetzen. I would like to welcome you to this afternoon session of Queering the Museum. This is a public program dedicated to queer issues in museums on the occasion of Europe Pride 2019. And I think many of you know that Vienna is hosting Europe Pride this year. The event started already and the Pride will be on 15th of June, next Saturday. So we had in the morning a presentation by a local housing project, Queerbau. This local presentation or presentation of local projects is always one fixed program in this public program series. And then we had Andreas Brunner with a very interesting talk about queer aspects of Prince Eugene of Savoy. In the afternoon, we will have hardcore art history. So I would like to introduce our next speaker. It is Dr. Clare Barlow. She's from London. She's an art historian. She worked at the National Portrait Gallery as well as a curator at the Tate Britain. And in 2017, she organized there the exhibition Queer British Art from 1861 to 1967. I put emphasis on this date because Stonewall was 2 years later. So queer, you did queer before queer existed. Let's say it like this. Clare is also a curator at the Wellcome Collection in London, and as I understood, you are right now working on a new display of the collection together with Turner Prize-winning collective Ensemble. So please welcome with me Clare Barlow. She will talk about queer British art, and after her talk, around 35 minutes, I will introduce you the next speaker, and then the two of them together with me will have a discussion also with you, with the audience. Welcome, Clare.
Thank you very much. It's really exciting for me to be revisiting this project. 2017 may not seem like a very long time ago, but certainly in terms of where museums have got to in the UK, it feels like a very long time. The reason why this show took place then was that it was 50 years since the partial decriminalisation of sex between men in England and Wales, not Scotland. That came later. And the reason why I spell out that whole sentence is that 1967 is often held up as this great sort of flagship year when everything changed, whereas in fact the change was partial, it was limited, but it was still significant. When I was talking to one of the people who had lent works to this show about 67, I said, did you notice any changes? He said, oh no, I was far too busy out partying. So I really pushed him and I said, was there nothing that changed? And he thought for a moment and he said, well, there was a lot less blackmail. And I think that does kind of capture something about it, that this wasn't a great moment of liberation for our community. Lots of us were still finding ways to be ourselves before and after that change. But at the same time, changes in laws do have an impact. And that's one of the things that this show wanted to highlight is what was happening before the law changed. It was an interesting process getting the show to launch at Tate. Previous projects on queer art in the UK, well, there hadn't really been one. There'd been 3 different exhibitions, Gay Icons at the NPG, which was where we asked the NPG asked LGBT celebrities to choose people who had been their queer icons. It was a photographic exhibition. There was Matt Smith's amazingly innovative Queering the Museum at Birmingham, which was a series of art installations around the gallery, kind of critiquing the absence of queer history. And there was, in Merseyside, a small show called Hello Sailor, Gay Life on the Ocean Wave. And that was more or less it. And there were lots of different sort of perceptions as to why that was it. One of the sort of viewpoints that people came out with when I talked about the fact that I wanted to do this show was, oh, well, you know, this all feels very old school, you know, we've got equality, yay! Why is it necessary? Another view was the kind of opposite view where I would say, I want to do a show about queer art, and people would say, is there any? And it was kind of, the show kept being caught between these two perceptions. This perception that obviously the sexuality of all of these artists, the possibilities of queer reading, all this was a fringe activity that was not part of kind of mainstream art history. And on the other side, the view that you know, such a show was unnecessary because everything that you could possibly say about LGBTQ identity must have already been said somewhere, so there was no need for museums to say it. I should stress that I think this was a museum's view rather than an academic view or the public's view. And it was something which, it was very exciting at Tate to be able to sort of lead a spearhead of change on. If people had thought about queer art, they mostly thought about things like this. The sort of Francis Bacon Two Figures series of it's very dark, it's very brooding, there's a sort of like dark, oppressive sexuality about it, as some of the catalogue labels, the old catalogue labels used to say. And I think that was kind of what people thought that queer life before the change in legislation looked like, that it was furtive, it was involved, you know, sexual acts, but, you know, it couldn't really get out of a box. As one of my collectors said, people think that before the law changed, we lived with our heads in the gas oven. And I think one of the things that I wanted to do with the show was to show the sheer variety of works that could be brought into view when you started foregrounding queer. An alternative to the Bacon might be something like this, by Charles Robert Ashby. It's a twin-handled cup on which Ashby has inscribed to the Ancient, which was his nickname for James Headlam, from CRA, on the mournful occasion of his transition into matrimony. So this marks a life event which lots of LGBTQ people went through, the event of transitioning into matrimony, of finding that sort of conventional fig leaf. But it's also a joke. You know, it's described very blatantly on the cup as a mournful occasion, and that actually feeds through into the design of a cup, which is slightly different for this one than other cups that Ashby shown, which had a very similar pattern. I think if you look at the stem of it, here, and you know, the sort of erect phallus that starts to come into view, and then the handles have these kind of drooping phalluses, so there's almost kind of like a joke about life before and life after going on. And Ashby himself is a very interesting character. There's some suggestion that he and Headlam were lovers. Certainly he had lots of relationships with men. He later made his own mournful transition. But before doing so, he wrote to his wife to say, "Hitherto, I have only loved men. But, you know, rest assured that although in the future there will be, you know, many comrade friends," which is how he refers to his male lovers, "there can only be one comrade wife." Mrs. Ashby accepts him on these terms, and later reflects on their marriage and says, well, you know, it was a bit annoying that he kept going up to London and sleeping with lots of guardsmen. But on the other hand, you know, he was a loving father, he was an attentive husband, and a genius. And, you know, as far as she's concerned, it could have been a lot worse. And I think this is the sort of narrative that we often lose from the history. This sense that lives were complicated and messy. People made different accommodations. They found different ways of living. And just because a marriage was unconventional doesn't always mean that it was unhappy. We found ways to support ourselves, to support each other, and to interact with the communities around us. And we sort of looked at this across a whole range of objects. The show started in 1861 because that was the end of the death penalty for sodomy in England, which meant that we were starting with these very sort of lush pre-Raphaelite aesthetic movement objects. We moved through sections looking at the theatre, looking at the ways that sexuality has been defined through Bloomsbury, ending with two kind of big hitters, Francis Bacon and David Hockney, whose early career was well underway at the time of the change of legislation. I didn't do it alone. I mean, I was the sole curator of the show, but I think crucial to its development was the amount of consultation we did. Consultation with academics, with Tate's general audience, with LGBTQ plus focus groups, with charities, LGBTQ plus focused charities. I went to open events at places like the Vauxhall Tavern or Bristol Pride, and also consultation with staff. I think for this exhibition it was very important that everyone understood this was something we were doing together as an organisation. Not everyone would agree with it, but everyone had to understand that it was a shared project, that this was why it was important, and this is what we were doing with it. And I did lots of kind of like just drop-in sessions for staff of talking about the show, so to help them understand where we were coming from. This was particularly important because of the title. When I said I wanted to call it Queer British Art, there was a sharp intake of breath, because the word queer was seen as incredibly problematic and difficult. And that's where the consultation was really useful. In talking to our general audience, the academics loved it because they'd been using it for decades. The general audience, those who were likely to come to the show, who had friends from the LGBT community, connections of the LGBT community, or who were LGBTQ themselves, they saw it as a very positive step. And those of them who didn't see it as a positive step also thought that the exhibition wasn't a positive step, so that was quite helpful. The reason why it was queer was also to bring into view a wide range of different sexualities and gender identities. Previously in British museums, LGBTQ history tended to be, and here are the people who we can clearly define as gay men over here. Here are a few lesbians, there's only 3 of them, but don't worry. And then over here, if we're really kind of stretching it, maybe there is one representative of a trans community. But certainly historically, that's not how people live their lives. When the show starts in the 1860s, there isn't a sense that sexual acts connect to identity in the same way that they do now. So there's actually a wide range of different relationships, different approaches to the self that we wanted to bring into view throughout the exhibition. And that brings me on to showing you some of the objects. So there were some things that connected to the more kind of traditional sense of queer history. This is Simeon Solomon's The Bride, the Bridegroom, and Sad Love. And Solomon is an amazing figure. He exhibited at the Royal Academy. He was incredibly successful he was connected to pre-Raphaelites. He was part of the aesthetic movement. But he also produced work that was very explicitly engaging with his identity as a man who was attracted to other men. And this is a more mournful take on the Ashby Cup. The bridegroom gently disentangling his hands from the male figure of sad love as he transitions into a married relationship. But your empathy is purely with sad love in the image. Simeon Solomon had a rather tragic story. He was very successful as an artist. He was then caught having sex with a man in a public toilet and spent the rest of his life in and out of lunatic asylums, in and out of prison, and died in comparative poverty. But he did continue to make work throughout that later period. It's not the case that this stifled his creative expression. But he has the sort of trajectory that I think we often associate with this period. But there were other figures who were more positive stories. This is Evelyn de Morgan's Aurora Triumphans, where you have the female figure of night and the female figure of a dawn, and dawn is gently plucking off the bonds of night as night departs. And the model for dawn is Jane Hales. Jane was part of Evelyn's household and life from before and after Evelyn's marriage to William de Morgan, the potter. She was a servant. She took care of Evelyn's sister's children. But Evelyn paints her again and again and again and again, often naked, often in very ecstatic poses, the some which are positively orgasmic. And when Jane dies, she's buried in the family plot next to Evelyn and her husband. These are all things we know. We don't know what the nature of that relationship is exactly because Evelyn's papers were burned. But I think that raises one of the things which I think often holds us back when we're looking for queer art. This sense that without a letter that says, you and me, last night, in the shrubbery, this is what we did, this is how I feel now, this is who I am now, that without that kind of gold star smoking gun letter, we can't talk about these relationships. Those letters don't exist for straight couples. I don't know why we're looking for them for LGBTQ couples. What we do know contextually is that if this was a sexual relationship, it was far from unique. There's lots of other women at the same time who are in relationships, who are married, who are in relationships with women, and sometimes their husbands know about them. There's one woman who actually, moves her female lover into the house next door. And providing these relationships don't threaten the heterosexual marriage and the production of children, to a larger extent, they're seen as, it's just her thing. They're semi-tolerated. And that was a part of the story which we really wanted to bring into view. It's not the case that sort of persecution is absolutely flat. Then there's works like this, where queerness comes, even at the time, in the eye of a beholder. Graham Robertson, the great art critic, went to see this painting when it was first exhibited, and says to his friend, "But my dear chap, that's not Aphrodite, that's Alessandro." Because the model for Venus in the painting is Alessandro de Marco, who's one of the most successful male models of his day. And Robertson, in his diaries, is very keen to point out that this isn't because Walter Crane is attracted to Alessandro, it's because Mrs. Crane won't let Walter paint nude women. But for Robertson, this opens up lots of queer possibilities in the image. Because the next line in his diaries is, "Still, she was a fine slip of a boy, and in the warm Italian sunlight passed for Venus well enough." And I think there's something there about this kind of fluidity, that gender is something that can be performed, that can be occupied in different ways, and that it doesn't have to be the artist's intention that permits a queer reading of the work. The show also had some familiar figures. This is, of course, Oscar Wilde. But I paired this portrait, which is the only surviving work from Wilde's own extensive art collection, with another object, which I'm sure some of you will recognise. This is the door of Wilde's cell at Reading Jail, where he was imprisoned. And I included that because, although it's not obviously an art object, I think it's a kind of icon for us. It's something which stops us brushing past Wilde's story and saying, "Oh yes, I know that, why should I engage with it?" But forces us to actually take a moment to reflect on what that meant, to look at the vast bulk of a man and the tiny jail cell door, and to think about what it might mean to go through that experience. There were also portraits of people who were campaigning for change. So this is Edward Carpenter by Roger Fry. And Carpenter lived up in the north of England with his boyfriend and was one of the strongest advocates for same-sex love. He wrote lots of pamphlets defending same-sex love. He was also a keen vegetarian and also believed in sort of socialism, a form of socialism. So, really interesting figure. But alongside these people's stories, who might be quite well known to some of my audience, we wanted to foreground some objects and figures who are less well known. So this is a fan made by Charles Ricketts for Ricketts' great friend, Michael Field. Michael Field was also two women, Edith Cooper and Catherine Bradley. They lived together. As a symbol of their union, they included interlocking wedding rings on the covers of their volumes of poetry. They co-wrote a diary together, and they developed a shared identity as Michael Field. And you can see on the fan, it says to M. Field down one of the sides. And it's an extraordinary story. I mean, they are an extraordinary couple. Their friends refer to them as the Michael Fields or as Michael Field. Sometimes one of them is Michael, sometimes one of them is Field, sometimes they are Michael Field, sometimes they are Edith and Catherine. It's this hugely fluid relationship, and it's a relationship which I think, it's a sort of relationship that you might overlook if you're leaping to try and classify people rather than just taking their queerness on their own terms. Also amongst the sort of like less well-known figures was Berto Pasuca. He was one of the founders of the Ballet Negre in London, which was the first black ballet company. And he's depicted in a series of photographs by Angus MacBain. And Pasuca and Bain were really good friends. To the extent that Pasuca modelled for MacBain for a series of boudoir pictures for Pasuca and his boyfriend at the time. But he also commissioned MacBain to produce these images to promote the Ballet Negre. So it was a very kind of like, although it's sort of MacBain behind the camera, this is Pasuca thinking about how he wants to be depicted. And that kind of connected to something which came out very clearly from the consultation, which was that people didn't want us to just be talking about art as objects. They also wanted us to be giving some context about queer life, about where people went, what they did, what they saw, what they engaged with. And one of my favourite objects for this was this wig and jewellery, which belonged to Jimmy Slater, who was one of a huge number of incredibly successful female impersonators on the stage. They're called female impersonators. Some of them nowadays we would see with a trans identity. That's not the same for Jimmy. Jimmy was much more of a sort of drag queen, what became the drag queen angle. But at the time, these were seen as very wholesome family entertainment. They were very common. And one reviewer of Jimmy's work said, gentlemen in the stalls who ought to know better fell half in love with him. And you can kind of see why. I mean, these are photographs of some of Jimmy's performances. Other works were there because of the reactions they provoked. So this is Duncan Grant's Bathing, which might look like a fairly staid depiction of sort of male nudes, maybe it's a bit Michelangelo-esque, but which caused such a row when it was installed at a young men's technical college that it caused one reviewer to describe it as degenerate and say that it would have a corrupting effect on the morals of the youth who were witnessing it. So I hope you're all feeling very corrupted from seeing the slide. Bathing was a theme that was very popular for Duncan Grant, as you can see from this much more explicitly erotic take on it. I think you don't have to look very far to see the exchange of glances, the sun-bronzed flesh, and the sort of implication of cruising that runs through this painting. Other works, Duncan Grant was not alone in creating a shock. This self-portrait by Laura Knight provoked an extraordinary review from Claude Phillips, who was the Telegraph's critic, who in the space of one paragraph describes it as boring, ugly, unfortunate, repellent, vulgar, and having something like the erotic charge, but still too boring to engage with. And he concludes it would have been better had it been left in the studio. And I don't think that kind of response makes sense unless you see it through the eyes of, a woman looking at a nude woman, and unless you see it through the lens of some of the things that are being said about these new categories that are coming through, such as the lesbian, which is starting to be more recognized at this point. At the same time, the show was not all naked bodies, much to the, to be honest, dismay of some of the critics, including the Telegraph's critic, who I think had come to the exhibition wanting to be shocked, and found works like this very hard to engage with. It's a nice domestic scene by Ethel Sands. This is Ethel's life partner, Nan Hudson, sitting on the sofa, and this is Walter Sickett, who's dropped in for tea with them. It was very important to me that the exhibition should include paintings like this under the rubric of queer, paintings that connected to the humdrum of everyday domestic life. And I felt that, it was important that all aspects of our lives got acknowledged, that it wasn't just, nude bodies pressing each other in the bedroom or in the shrubbery, but it should instead try and connect with the fact that some people had very successful life relationships and, wanted to record those in paint. Connected to that, there's Dora Carrington's portrait of Lytton Strachey. Now, Strachey was almost exclusively, pretty much exclusively attracted to men, whereas Carrington had relationships with both men and women. But for both of them, the other was the person who understood them most and who helped them to understand themselves most. And I think that's a really important facet of queer life, that sometimes the person who helps you to see yourself isn't a lover. Sometimes it is, a friend or a mentor or somebody who acknowledges you as you are. And so it was very important to include moments like this in the show. Having said that, there was a degree of raunch at various different points, sometimes very thinly concealed. So this is John Minton's horse guards in their dressing rooms at Whitehall. I got several angry letters about my interpretation of this one. And it's from a series of prints that was produced for the Coronation album, so a very sort of formal commission. And it passes completely without notice from the people who commission it. But it's very different to all of the other prints in the series, whereas the other prints depict guards on parade and kind of people looking butch in front of buildings and, other sort of London landmarks and that kind of thing. John Minton's gone for this very intimate scene of a guardsman sitting on a bed with an array of objects, with little bare feet poking out. And there's something very tender about it. Tender, but also perhaps erotic, when you realise that at this time, guardsmen are very associated with the male-male sex trade, and that going up to London for a touch of scarlet, as it gets called at various points, is a fairly established queer pastime. And if you don't believe me, this is a box of buttons amassed by Richard Chopping and Dennis Wirt Miller, which were also in the show. And each button is the memento of a liaison with a guardsman who was stationed near where they lived. Whenever one of them had a liaison with a guardsman, they would ask for a button and they'd put it in the box. And there's over 200 buttons in the box. And the only reason we knew the significance of this story was because somebody who had known them had inherited some of the objects in their house and had taken this object, which he knew the story of, and was able to share it. And I think that also highlights an important thing about our history, that unless we preserve it, these stories are lost. And an object like this, which is so evocative, just becomes a box of buttons again. And in the light of that, I think John Minton's Guardsman suddenly develops a slightly more erotic charge. Those objects on the bed begin to look slightly more fetishistic, the bare feet slightly more sexy, the boots slightly more notable. And this is entirely in keeping with Minton, and it's entirely in keeping, who chronicled his sexual practices in incredible detail across his diaries, including liaisons with several servicemen. But it's also in keeping with the sort of games that artists at this point are starting to play, of the visible and the invisible, the community of insiders, the community of outsiders. These worlds collide with Orton and Halliwell's collaged books. Orton and Halliwell were a couple. They lived in a flat in Islington, and they took books out of Islington libraries. Some they borrowed, some they stole. They cut out the illustrations, wallpapered their flat with them, and then created new covers for the books. They would then slip the book back onto the shelf of the library and lurk about, waiting to see who would pick it up and what their reaction would be. And you can see here some of the different things that they've done with the books. So the murder mystery, The Secret of Chimneys, has become a camp story about marrying cats. The Lunts have become these little sort of sweet kitsch figurines. Queen's Favourite has developed a pair of homoerotic wrestlers, whereas the titles of the collected plays of M. Williams have all been changed to be things like Knickers Must Fall, Up the Front, Up the Back, and Fucked by Monty. And it's a game, but it's also a political game. It's a game about reclaiming public space, and it's a game about the visible and the invisible, and what happens when that queer banquet of references gets put into the public space of a library. Tragically, they get caught eventually for a library sting operation. The story of that is fairly extraordinary. And they get sent to prison, which for Orton, it gives him time to develop as a writer. For Halliwell, it absolutely destroys him. And sadly, when he comes out, he's incredibly depressed. He becomes more and more depressed and ends up killing Orton and then killing himself. So there's a very tragic end to the story. But I think objects like this capture the vibrancy of queer culture and the vibrancy of what you can do once you have a banquet of references, of visual references that you can play with in these creative ways. And I think things like that make the Francis Bacon that I started with and the David Hockney that the show ended with look slightly different. Not just as an artist working out, their own, very distinctive vision, but also as objects that connect to a wider queer culture. In both Hockney and Bacon's case, the culture of physique magazines. This was a selection of some of the physique magazines we were able to borrow for the show. And Hockney, just in case you missed that that's what he's trying to do, has even helpfully put the word physique across the top of a painting. One of the stories he told about this painting was that when he was at the RCA, he was often asked, he had to paint a nude for his final exam. And everyone was painting the kind of female nudes which were on offer. And Hockney said, I couldn't do that. I didn't feel that, I wasn't attracted to them. And so instead, he paints this life-size blow-up of one of the models in one of his physique magazines. And just in case you'd kind of missed the point, he contrasts this buff-bronzed Californian figure with the desiccated skeleton behind of a kind of fuddy-duddy old school of art history. And the fact that Hockney, I think, makes this gesture and tells this story about it highlights something which I think is really important when thinking about this work, that adding the life stories in It's one aspect of it, it's one way of seeing it, but it is actually important. It was important to artists who they loved. It was important to them what they chose to depict, how they spent their lives. And I think by trying to hermetically seal works away from this context and say, oh, yes, 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 but the art, isn't helpful. It doesn't help us to kind of get the sort of full picture of where this art comes from. We did lots of kind of community work around the exhibition. One thing we did in the final room was we gave the members of the public the opportunity to leave postcards which they could write, you know, a comment or a thought or their own caption for the work. And throughout the exhibition, we threaded a series of those audience captions next to some of the paintings. We also reached out to LGBTQ activists before the show went up and got them to write a series of captions. So you encountered lots of different perspectives as you were going round. Because it was a historic story, it was very important to connect it up to the queer community today. So I managed to get a partnership with Channel 4 Random Acts, and they brought out 6 short films, all created by LGBTQ people, looking at, you know, different aspects of life, different individuals and their story. And, you know, they were a really extraordinary set of commissions. We also had a Queer and Now festival, which is, I'm pleased to say, now in its 2nd year, hopefully going to make a 3rd year, which was programmed to be entirely kind of capturing a diverse range of different queer artists, queer experience. We had dancing, we had discos, we had cruising for art, which was a thing by Brian LaBelle, where you could wander around a gallery waving a handkerchief, and, you know, people, performance artists would come up and interact with you. And we also, because we didn't want it to just be the case that we had a paid exhibition and that was enough, we produced a free queer walk through British art, which connected to our permanent collection. About 20 to 30% of the objects in the exhibition were from the permanent collection, but this was a way of also ensuring that for visitors who just came on site but who couldn't afford an exhibition ticket, that they would be able to still have a trip that was worth their while, and they would be able to do a tour around the permanent collection, seeing work that was relevant to their interests. There were some other partnerships. We had a conference sponsored by the Paul Mellon Centre. Pride in London launched at Tate. The catalogue, edited by me, is still available in all good bookshops. And we also did a radio series, which was fronted by Simon Cowell. And all of these different activities, I think, allowed different audiences to interact with what we were doing. They also, I think, helped us to explore different facets of the stories that were on offer. And all of this made the show a huge success. This is my sort of very short Queer British Art in numbers. The exhibition ran for 6 months, but the programme went on for longer. The audience was very diverse, but they all loved it. We had over 90% of visitors rated it as excellent or very good, which is very unusual, actually, for a Tate show. But, I mean, it's very unusual for any show, but, I mean, this was a show that people took particularly to their heart, I think. And I was blown away by some of the comments, particularly in the final room. Somebody actually wrote to me to say that when they were leaving the exhibition, they hadn't felt that they could write a postcard because they'd never told anyone about their sexuality. But when they got home, they really regretted it, so they'd now written their postcard, and would I mind putting it in the space for them, which of course I did. Someone else just wrote on their card, I think it might be safe for me to come out now. And I think that is the power of what we do in museums, that it's not about changing minds necessarily, or presenting people with an argument that is going to transform how they think, although that's lovely when that does happen. But it's also about finding ways to connect with people, to reflect people things that they know and things that they don't know, to challenge their perceptions around things, but also to affirm people. And for me, that was one of the greatest successes of the show. Thank you very much.